Hi, my name is Aneace Haddad. One of the most difficult things for me is when a taxi driver asks me where I'm from. It's like, oh no, what am I going to say this time? So, my background, I was born in Austin, Texas, but didn't live there too long. My mother's family came from there. My father's from Iraq, and I grew up in a bit in the US, Colorado, Baghdad for a few years when I was little, and Libya for a few years from 10 to 17. That was in a French community in Tripoli. So I developed very strong, deep ties to France. And after going back to Colorado to finish my university degree and everything, I went off and I worked and lived in France for around 18 years. Italy for a few years before that. And now I've been in Singapore for the last almost 10 years now. So would I define myself as a TCK? I think, yeah, that's pretty obvious. I mean, I really have a mixed background and lived in multiple places even during the formative years. So I don't really have any roots. Definitely no roots really in the US, although all my family is still there. I've got kids in the US. Deeper roots probably in France, but I can't say I'm French. And now in Singapore, Singapore has been the best for me. There are a lot of people like me in Singapore, a lot of people who have not only a mixed background, mixed cultural background, but they've lived different places as children and as adults. So here, when I tell my story, it's not so weird. If I'm in the US or France and I tell my story, it just sounds very strange, especially the US right now. It's like, what? Baghdad and Tripoli? The places that they hate the most. So yeah, it's really, it's amazing to see how many people like me there are in Singapore. So it's a very comfortable place for someone like me. Even though I've lived a lot overseas all my life and worked in many different countries, I think I was an expat for a period of maybe 1.5 years of my life. The vast majority of my work has been much more as a local employee. Although I've run my own companies mainly most of my life. I started a big company in France, something that became a bigger company in France, started in 1996, and that was in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France, grew it to 30 countries, and sold it in 2007. I had a large team in Singapore, so I was coming here very often, and I just settled here just before I sold my company. Since then, I've become a lot more involved with coaching and training and facilitating, and it just feels like all the years of trying to understand my identity, living in multiple places, growing an international company from scratch, loving interacting with people all over the world, a lot of self-development during those years. And it feels like at some point, self-development kind of switched into what can I do for others? So coaching and training and facilitating and mentoring and all of that is really an area that allows me to use all of my background, all of my experience, all of my knowledge of people, cultures, and all of that, and the common humanity that we all have. All of it really comes together very nicely in my work today. Let's see, what other questions did you have? TCKs in Asia and the rest of the world. Yeah, definitely see differences. I think in Asia, well, speaking mainly Singapore, the large cities in Asia, Singapore, Hong Kong, I think what we see out here is that TCKs are not really bizarre people. There are a lot of us, and we're very comfortable with our multinational, multicultural backgrounds. In Europe, TCKs tend to be more mixes of Europeans. So it's a little different there. And very quickly, people need to become assimilated into the country that they're in. The US is even worse. I mean, US, you really have to be American, have an American accent very fast. You may be seen as an immigrant, or if your family, your parents maybe were immigrants. In my case, it was just my dad. I don't know if he was really an immigrant. He was here. He met my mom when he was finishing his PhD in mathematics. He was a math professor. So when we traveled, when I was a kid, we tended to be in university towns. So hard to really categorize my father as an immigrant, and my mother definitely wasn't. So it's very difficult. In the US, if you're an immigrant or son of immigrants, daughter of immigrants, it kind of fits the mold that everybody understands. When you're outside the mold that people understand, it's very hard. The conversation just often kind of stops. In Asia, people see people like us every day. So it feels like here we're able to be a lot more of who we are. It's easier to be authentic. I can say that I grew up I was in Baghdad for a few years when I was little. I was in Tripoli from 10 to 17, France for 18 years, Italy for a few years before that. Yeah, it's kind of colorful. It's a little bit out of the ordinary, but it's not Martian. Europe and the US, it's a lot more bizarre having that kind of a background. We're a drop of water in the ocean of something a lot bigger. So yeah, I think there's a very big difference with TCKs here versus Europe and the US. And then of course there are exceptions. I mean, Europe, I'm talking about mainly Paris, France, some London. Yeah, a lot of this is present in London as well. People immigrate there. Here, TCKs, we're not immigrants. I've never thought of myself as an immigrant anywhere. Yeah, that's a weird concept of being an immigrant. But TCKs in Europe and the US tend to be assimilated with immigrants because that's what makes sense. What else? Is a new term needed? I don't think so. The term TCK is new anyway. I think that over time, that term will just kind of disappear as well because of so many of us filling this kind of role. There are more and more of us doing this. I mean, when I was a kid, we were kind of out of the ordinary. Now there are a lot of people like that. A lot of people that have grown up in different countries, different cultures, speak different languages from very early age. So it's becoming a lot more common, and we may at some point hit some kind of a threshold where there's so many people like us that have traveled and grown up different places that the term TCK just kind of becomes not very useful. These big shifts are quite fascinating, these thresholds. If you look at the number of people that are now connected globally with mobile internet or just a plain internet, in 2 or 3 years, we're supposed to have around 50% of the global population will be on the internet. In 4 years, we expect 50% of the world population to be on mobile internet. So there's a big shift that's happening there. 5 years ago, 54% of human population became urbanized. So we moved from an agrarian culture to a city culture, and now we've hit a critical mass of people living in cities, which I believe will have a big impact on empathy, the ability to get along with other people close by that are not direct relatives or members of the same clan or even same religion or same nationality. So these types of thresholds, hitting 50%, are pretty critical. Another big one was a little bit of history. I love this stuff. 5,000 years ago, 50% of us became farmers. Of course, 10,000 years ago, farming began, but it took a few thousand years before a critical mass of human beings lived off of farming. And immediately, immediately in terms of the long view, immediately all the major world religions were born right after that. So as soon as we hit 50% critical mass of human beings living on farms, all of a sudden we had Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. All of these came about like in a blink. For 50,000 years before that, it was nature-based religions, shamanism, things like that. What's fascinating is today, as we become globalized and we become more nomadic again, we're seeing a return to nature-based spirituality. So a lot of the things that came about through agriculture, then the Industrial Revolution, all of these things were based on sitting still, staying in the same place. If not on the same farm in the same village, at least in the same country. So we saw the rise of nation states with the industrial age. All of these things started really 5,000 years ago when 50% of us became farmers. Now we're at the other end of that. Very few of us are farmers today. A large number of us are traveling. 50% of us are globally connected. 50% of us live in cities. We're seeing the agricultural age religions all suffering today, and a lot of violence in the part of the world where my family or my father's family comes from. Things that I'm very, very aware of. And it feels like this is all happening because subconsciously, culturally subconsciously, we are sensing a big move into a new phase of humanity that is far more nomadic than we've seen over the last centuries or last couple thousand years. Much more nomadic, much more nature-based, the desire to save the world, the desire to heal the world. All of these things are things that we're really starting to see in the younger generations, and especially, in my opinion, especially driven by people who travel and who have lived in different countries. We are a bridge, in a way, to that old world, which is still the dominant world today. We're a bridge because we see the world differently. We see the world in much more accepting ways. We're not afraid of uncertainty. We're used to uncertainty. We're used to living in countries which are not ours, quote unquote. I've lived all my life as someone who's not allowed to vote in the country where he's living and producing and providing value, because I haven't lived most of my life in a country where I'm a citizen. So yeah, fascinating times, and very excited about what we can bring to the world. And I'm really glad I discovered Singapore discovered living in Singapore 10 years ago. This is a wonderful place for people like me. And thank you for the opportunity to talk today.